All right, let's continue on our journey. Try to understand a little better of what we're doing here with digital information. We're going to shift gears and then we'll come back to Unicode. This information is about how do we measure the information that we have. And we use this in storage, we use it in data transfer rates. And so we use bits and bytes quite a bit. Actually a bit, right? That's the smallest unit. That's that individual 0 or 1 in binary. That's that one location, if it's a 0 or if it's a 1. The next thing they actually don't mention, which is a nibble. A nibble is 4 of those put together, and then a byte is 8 of those put together. So 8 bits together form a byte. They spell that differently. The value of a single byte can range from 0 to 255. So you have quite a bit of numbering that you can actually do within a byte of information. And then kilobytes, even these days, are really small. And this is where it starts to get a little confusing, because a kilobyte, they say 1 kilobyte is equal to 1,000 bytes. Well, that's the easy way to put it. We'll look at another chart here in a minute. It's actually 1,024. And because of the fact that we're using this 2 position, we end up with 2s, 4s, 8s, and then 16s, and then 32s, and then 64s. And so it's not quite a clean break in 1,000 bytes. And then a megabyte equals 1,000 kilobytes, and then so on down the list. I'm actually not going to go through that because that's a little redundant, but we're way up here in the terabyte level, and it goes beyond that. It goes into yottabytes and so on, and you can look up a chart on that. A physical signal, such as text, numbers, and graphics or sound, is interpreted by converting it into binary numbers, which we have already talked about. Well, then you've got the process of encoding integers or encoding text, right? So integers can have a positive or negative value, and encoding text, that's not going to have that, right? And we're not dealing with numbers there. So computers represent text by using 1s and 0s in that signaling process. And then you have, okay, well, how do we deal with, again, these are speed ratings, these are data transfer rates, this is how much memory we have. These terms are used all over the place with bits and bytes and kilobytes, megabytes and gigabytes and terabytes. Again, another 5 or 6 years and we'll be in yottabytes, but or beyond the zettabyte. You look it up and see where that stuff lands. Anyway, processing speeds. So in a 64-bit processors, computers can receive or send 8 bytes of data at once. So we'll do that in a 64-bit processor. We can send 8 bytes of data just once. And that's, well, how often is that? Well, it depends on the hertz rating or 1 cycle per second. So when you deal with this hertz, megahertz, kilohertz, gigahertz, that kind of thing, right? We're up here at gigahertz. That's 1 billion hertz. That's 1 billion hertz, 1 billion cycles per second in a gigahertz. So we're dealing with processors that are 2.4s, 3.2s, that have a boost of about 4 gigahertz. And that's how many 1 cycle per second. Wow. So we're doing billions of cycles per second, and we can chuck in, right, in a 64-bit processor, 8 bytes, 8 bytes, and then times that by billion, right? That's how much your processor can process if it's just doing a 1 gigahertz process, which, phones are like 1.2s between that and 1.7s. But then we also use it in storage, right? That's why people will get confused. I'll even have computer majors that will get confused, because you start using the same types of measuring as you did when you were talking about throughput, which is next, or storing it in RAM. That's especially true because storing in RAM is a temporary volatile storage, as you'll learn. It's not going to stay there. And then your hard drive or your SSD is going to stay there, but it's using the same method to measure the storage. So there you are. There's our other our other list of saying, hey, actually, gigabyte is 1,024 megabytes. So take the 1,000 off the front of that, and you say 24 megabytes. That's why hard drives, when you go out and buy them, they like to use this representation. That way, they're actually throwing out 24 megabytes of storage. So these days, if you go out and say, I'm going to buy a terabyte drive, that should be 1,024 gigabytes, but that's not what they're doing. What they'll do is they'll break it down to bytes, and then they'll actually show you, oh, this is how many, gigabytes that you have. And they'll label it on the drive, right? They'll label it when you buy that thing. Oh, this is 1,000 gigabytes. Well, that's not actually really what it's supposed to be, right? They're cheating us through advertising. Now, throughput, that's the amount of data that's transmitted to another computer within the system. So you've got data channels within the system. They call them data buses, and that's transferring between CPU and RAM, or CPU and hard disk, and that kind of thing, back and forth. And how we rate that is throughput. It's also computer to computer, which is throughput, talking to the computer. It's a way of saying how fast is this going to get to the other side. So when they talk about PC bus speeds, they're talking about the RAM to CPU and on and on and on. And that's rated in those gigabytes and terabytes as well. So what they're telling you is basically, oh no, they have a little bit here about dynamic RAM. So we'll talk about DRAM. So the system memory is the same thing. To give you a little heads up, you have a system bus that's going to have a measurement in throughput that goes to the system memory. And that system memory will have a measurement in throughput, and those two should match together. This stuff really gets into being able to read all that stuff on a computer when you're like, I'm going to buy this, or if you're going to build your own, like we do in this course. You can build your own computer if you got the money, and use this course to do it. We look at those numbers when we get to the hardware section. This is what it's based off of. So random access memory means that I can randomly access any one of those little tiny storage spaces on what we would call a RAM stick. And it is volatile, meaning once you turn the system off, it's going to clear it out. It's not going to be there anymore. So we don't want to store anything permanently in RAM, otherwise we're going to be in trouble. Dynamic RAM, that's often used for our main processing. So when you go out and buy RAM and upgrade your computer by putting it in, that's usually DRAM. And those DRAM cells, that's integrated circuit composed of a capacitor and a transistor. So inside those RAM chips, you're going to have a little tiny cell. And what it includes is an integrated circuit, an IC. It is an IC composed of a capacitor and a transistor. And the data bit is held in the capacitor until the electrical discharge happens. So it's held there until basically it's commanded to discharge that. So the DRAM is pulsed with a new electrical charge every few milliseconds in order to retain a data bit. Realize, right, you're playing a game and you stored this in RAM, or I'm right here on this computer. This is stored in RAM, so I can see it. In order to maintain what is on my screen, then the DRAM is pulsed with an electrical signal every few milliseconds. Otherwise, the electrons will go away, and then you don't have a 1 there anymore, or you don't have a 0 there anymore, and it can't show you what it needs to show you. And that happens all the time. Now, the other one is called synchronous DRAM. So you can see we're using dynamic RAM, we're using DRAM. But this one's synchronous, and that means that it is synchronized to the system bus. So dynamic RAM can actually not be synchronized with the bus that's carrying the information back and forth, meaning that bus may be slower or faster than the RAM itself. Synchronous DRAM means that it is synchronized between that. It is moving just as fast or just as slow as the system bus, and so that's synchronized between them. And this is very, very, very common these days. That's why when you go into the section where we start talking about RAM and we start talking about, hey, you need to make sure that it's DDR4 whatever, 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 with all these numbers in the back of it, you're actually specifying, all right, my system bus is this fast, and I'm going to get DRAM that matches that speed because it needs to be synchronous. A dual inline memory module, DIMM, that is actually physically the RAM stick, and it's made of DRAM circuits, and a dual inline memory module will mean that you've got memory on both sides. And then which these days that's so standard. A DIMM is standard. We used to have SIMs, which were single inline memory modules, which meant the memory was on only one side, and you didn't have that anyway. And then small outline DIMMs are basically, or SODIMMs are used in laptops and tablets. So when we can make it bigger, it's cheaper. And that's why DIMMs for computers and upgrading your standard PC is usually cheaper than upgrading a notebook, because we have to take the same amount of RAM and slam it into a smaller space, and that is a more expensive process. And so anytime you're shrinking that space down and putting things in a more compact place, it is more expensive to do that kind of thing. I'm going to throw this in. The only time that that doesn't hold true, since I'm hoping you're working in technology for a long time, is when they have stopped doing the other process. So if they said to themselves, you know what, out with DIMMs, we're not going to even include a space on the motherboard for them. We're just going to use SODIMMs. It'll take up less space. That's what we're doing. Then that would become such a standard that it would become more expensive to buy the DIMM, because either they're not making them anymore, and you're using up old stock, or they're still making some of them, but the process for making them, because it's not the standard, is a little more expensive for them to do. That's not in the material, but that's something that you'll see over time, that always shrinking that part down and putting it in a smaller space is a more expensive proposition to do, until it becomes, this is the only way we do it. And then the old way of doing it, now that becomes something that's more expensive. All right, we'll continue with more concepts.